All right, welcome and thanks for joining us for part 2 of our summer webinar series, Magento 2 Extension Development, Module Development. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please submit your questions at any time in the question pane on the right side of your screen. You can follow us today on Twitter at Interact1, and you can tweet using M2Dev. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ryan.
All right, thank you, Amanda. So this is part 2 of our 3-part summer series. The last one we had was setup, where we got everything ready to go for module development all the way through to submitting our module to the marketplace. Today is part 2, which we're going to be doing module development. So what we're going to be doing is a live development exercise. So you're going to actually see me doing coding on the screen and working with my IDE and getting all those tips and tricks about how to do Magento 2 module development. Now you can go to the Interact1 website at interact1.com to watch part 1, and also you can go to interact1.com as well to sign up for part 3 of the webinar. So definitely check that out. So part 2 development is what we're going to be doing today. Live development is what we're going to be working with, so I'm actually going to have my IDE up, like I said, and we're going to be doing some live coding exercises. We're also going to be talking about a couple of best practices as we go through this live exercise, and we're also going to talk about some tips and tricks, and as well as some errors that you may encounter as you're going through this. So with that, let me pull up my IDE. Okay, so basically what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be developing a real live module today. Now, we're not going to go through every small little nuance because in real life and in real practice, that of course is going to take hours to do. Full unit testing, regression testing, going through all that kind of stuff. We're not going to cover that today in the limited time we have. But what we are going to talk about and what we're going to perform is how to develop a real module. So we're going to take you through the steps of setting up the module. We're going to take you through the steps of finding out the best solution possible, analyzing some of the code, and working through all of that. So the module we're going to be developing today is going to be basically a GeoIP redirect module. And so you might be asking, well, what exactly is that? The basic functionality of the GeoIP redirect module we'll be building today is essentially saying, based upon the geographic region that your IP is telling our site or telling the Magento 2 site, will help you determine what store view is going to be pulled up. So it's going to essentially switch your store for you automatically without having your users do it instead. So some people will do this on the Apache level or something like that, but what we're going to do is we're going to do it on the Magento 2 level. And we're going to kind of go into the code and see how things are working, and then make our appropriate alteration using the best practices for Magento 2. So for the GeoIP redirect, what we want to look at first is where can we hook into this, or what is it that sets our store for us. So if we take a look at the code of the Magento 2 platform, there's a couple of different things. First of all, your code might be slightly different than this. And what I mean by that is that if you go into app code, for example, you may not have a Magento folder. You may not even have an app code, and that's okay. If you use Composer in order to create your project, you'll find that all into the vendor namespace or in the vendor folder. It'll be under a Magento subfolder, and you'll find things like the Magento framework in there. You'll find the core code in there, and you can follow along based upon that. If you clone it from GitHub, which is more of a core contributor based way to get your code, then you'll find them in their other appropriate areas that like you see on my screen. So digging in a little bit, we need to figure out a couple of things. First of all, we need to figure out how we can set that store. And the second thing we need to figure out is how we can customize Magento 2. So if we go into the store module, before in Magento 1 this was located more in the core module, but Magento 2 was much more modular in its development approach. So things are much more separated than they used to be. So if I look into the store module and I look into the Etsy folder, I can look in a couple of different areas to determine exactly what it is that allows the store functionality to be set. I can look inside of the DIXML, which stands for dependency injection, and I can look under it in a couple of different scopes. So I can look at it under the front end, or I can just look in the global one, which is right under the Etsy folder. So if I take a look, I can try and see if I can find where that store might get set. And I can look through the code and I can say, well, you know, is it inside of here? Maybe it's in the front end. And if so, I can look under there. So looking under DIXML and then maybe looking under the front end DIXML as well to see if I can find where that is going to be set. So I'm not request processor, and it is front controller request processor. So it might be in the global one. So let's look in the global one. And so as you work with Magento more and more often, you'll start to get an idea of where the stuff is kind of being set and where the stuff you can look for. So let's see if I can find where it's located. Resolver, group collection, store collection, model store, store manager, store resolver. A couple of different places where we could possibly find it. And let's see if I can find where it's located here. I might just need to search for it. Context, framework app helper context, HTTP, front controller, install. Let's see if I can look under any of these. Store cookie, proxy, and resolver. Okay. So based upon what we see inside of here, we can determine that there is a plugin system that allows us to look at the request object. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry, the action, and then plugin context. Okay. Inside of here, we have a plugin system. Now, Magento 2's plugin system allows you to perform certain actions before, after, or around any public method inside of the Magento 2 architecture. It's kind of the successor to the old rewrite system, because rewrite systems were very, very powerful and flexible in Magento 1, but the Magento 2 system makes it so it's a little bit more friendly with multiple modules working in conjunction with one another. In the Magento 1 system, the rewrites would basically overwrite one another, and they would conflict with one another if one or more modules were attempting to rewrite the same class. In Magento 2, the plugin system allows multiple modules to make alterations to different functionality within the same class without essentially stepping on each other, if you will. So going in here, I see that there is an around dispatch, and this takes place against the front controller. Okay, and inside of here we have a couple of different things. So right here we have a default store that gets fetched from our store manager. We have the store code getting fetched from the parameter, and its code and its default value is the store code right here. So it's looking either in the HTTP request or from the store code from the cookie, which means that we can possibly use one of those two or both of those in order to maybe set those cookies. So why are we looking in this dispatch method against this app request interface or against this controller? The reason being is that in Magento 2 you have the full page cache to work with. If a full page cache can fulfill a request from the very beginning, then the things like the front controller won't get dispatched. So we have to make sure that we're hitting it before the full page caching intercepts and essentially processes the request for us. So what we want to do is we want to be able to set that beforehand. And we're going to do that with just a module. Basically, we can get this store code from the cookie here, and we can set that value and then let this particular plugin come in later and be able to grab that value. So that's essentially what we want to do here. Take the store cookie manager, get the store code from the cookie. We're going to set that store inside of this cookie manager. So when it hits this plugin a little bit later on, that's when we're going to be able to let the store module kind of take over its functionality from there. So that being said, we need to create our module. So what we'll do is go in to our code base, and we're going to set up our first module. Now there's a couple of things that we're going to do with the IDE to help speed up our development time. First of all, what I like to do, and this is PHP Storm is the IDE I'm using, you of course can use your own IDE, is under the code section. What I'll do is I will mark this directory as what's called a sources root. And what that'll do for me is it'll auto-complete the namespaces according to the PSR auto-loading standards, meaning that according to the directory structure and the class name, we'll derive how the file name is, according to the directory structure and file name, we'll derive how the class name is used as well as the namespace. So inside of this, under code, I'm going to create a directory, and that's going to be called interact1. And I'm going to call it GeoIP Redirect. Okay? And of course, every module is going to contain an etc folder, which stands for etc. not going to upload for this particular exercise. And inside of here, what we need is we need to have what's called a module XML. And that's essentially like our module declaration file in M1 equivalent of app.etsy modules. So inside of here, I'm going to create a module XML. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up this M2 module XML under new. And you might be saying, well, what is that? What am I doing there? Why am I using this instead of maybe typing it out? What I'm using is I'm using a template module, and it's going to be called Interact 1 GeoIP Redirect. Okay? And so what this is basically I'm just taking and saving code that I commonly use as a template file. And this makes it a lot easier to develop your modules. And this also helps you avoid things like spelling errors or invalid node nesting or those common errors that you kind of come up with when you're working with Magento 2 as a platform, or even taking it more generically, any platform in general. They usually have sometimes a little bit more strict ways that you do things or very strict node nesting structures. And this allows you to kind of auto-complete that automatically. So, for example, you always want to make sure your URN is correct, and you want to make sure that it's mapping to the right namespace schema location. And these templates can help you do that. If you go into Tools, Save File as a Template, and you can specify what the name is, and you can also specify variable names. So this one, for example, is module name. And whenever you're prompted to create that template file, you'll be prompted to enter those things like you saw me just do now. Very useful to speed up your development time. And so I created a module XML, and the next thing I want to create is a registration.php. Okay? And that is located in the root of the module folder. So I'm going to do the same thing. I created a registration file, registration.php. Well, I don't need the extension. And it is once again Interact 1 GeoIP Redirect. And if you'll notice, it filled everything in for me that it needed to fill in. So that is what I now have as my registration. So what's the difference between module and what's the difference between registration? The module is kind of like allowing your system be aware that there is a module available as well as a version number that corresponds to it. The registration PHP just lets your module be known as an available module to the Magento platform. So this means that your module is known to exist without it automatically being installed just because it's present or aware in the system. This gives you more control to be able to enable and disable your module at will without having your code have to be absent or present at that appropriate time. So we have our registration file, and it's just registering through the component registrar. And we're not going to get into every little nuance about every little thing because we don't have that much time. But this is a component, this is registering through the component registrar, and then the Magento 2 command line, for example, can enable the module or something else to that effect. The last thing we want to do is we want to create a composer.json file. Okay. I do believe, yep, I have an M2 composer. Composer, module name, interact 1, GeoIP redirect, in a namespace, interact 1, GeoIP redirect. I might be doing this casing wrong, but that's okay. I can fill it in as necessary. Yeah, I was doing the casing a little bit wrong there. Interact 1 GeoIP redirect. Okay. Space there. And basically we have our description, we have the name, which I actually need to flip there. Interact 1 GeoIP redirect. Okay. And any requirements. You can also specify third-party library requirements that will be automatically loaded through Composer. You can also specify core modules that are required for this. That's especially useful, especially if there are times whenever a installation might have that disabled. So this one will require that in order to be enabled, because by default there are certain modules that you cannot disable upon the installation of Magento, but there are certain core ones that you can. And so this allows you to create that dependency. You can also create the dependency inside of the module.xml file. It's under what's called a sequence. So if I do this, and here I can put a sequence. and then module names and so on and so forth. Okay. Now we don't need that for this particular one because the module that we're requiring is the store module, which is one of those ones you cannot disable for Magento 2. Okay. So we have our module.xml, we have our registration.php, and we also have our composer.json file. Now, for this particular exercise, what we're going to do is we're going to add a column onto the store table, and that's inside of the database. Okay. So inside of the redirect module, we have our Etsy, composer.json, and registration.php, and we also want to perform basically what's called an installation or upgrade script. So we'll create a directory inside of our GeoIP redirect, and we're going to call it setup. Now, setup is basically the equivalent of the SQL folder or the data folder inside of M1, if you're familiar with M1. And inside of here, we're going to create a PHP class. And inside of that, we're going to call this upgrade schema. Okay? And if you'll notice, the file name is being populated automatically as well as the class name and the namespace. So that was because I marked that source's root as my directory, and it completed everything for me, which makes things like small misspellings and stuff a lot easier to debug, because you know you're not going to have those types of misspellings in there. It makes things a lot easier. So we have our upgrade schema, and some of you might be asking right now, well, wait a minute, why aren't we using an install schema? First of all, it's perfectly okay to use an install schema. Install schema allows you to, upon the initial installation of your module, have that installation run. And after that install has been run, it'll never run again. Okay? Secondly, the upgrade schema will run every time there's a discrepancy between the version number that's recognized through Magento and the version number in your module XML. Right now we just have this set up as a default 2.0. Whatever semantic versioning you want to use is just fine. But upgrade schema will run every single time. And if you code your definitions and your attributes and stuff like that correctly, you don't need to create a bunch of version compares and stuff like that inside of here. What I mean by that is Magento's ORM in their system is pretty smart, meaning that if you try and add an attribute twice, it will recognize that the attribute already exists and not necessarily throw an error. It'll just change whatever properties you want to change on it. The same thing goes through installing tables or altering tables by adding columns or anything like that. Magento is smart enough to check the record or the schema definition against that particular table or that element you're trying to create and just make the appropriate updates to the properties that you want to change. So upgrade schema does implement an interface. Okay, so we're going to do implements, and that is upgrade schema interface right here. Okay. So right here in my IDE, you can see that it's throwing this kind of error right here. And if I do an Alt plus Enter, I can add the method stubs automatically. And what did that do? That completed the use for the namespaces at the top. It completed the implemented method that I needed to use automatically. It allows you to basically speed up your development time. So we have our upgrade schema, and basically what we want to do is, for the sake of being able to easily look up the store without having to do a bunch of relational tables and things like that, is we're just going to add a column to the store table. Nothing fancy, nothing specific, and nothing that's going to necessarily interfere with what currently exists, so we won't make that particular column required or anything like that. We'll just make it nice and easy. So inside of the method itself, which is upgrade, you have two arguments that get passed. One is the setup schema interface, one is the module context interface. Now, the setup schema interface is the equivalent of your installer that you saw in M1's installation and upgrade scripts. It's basically the setup classes. Your module context interface is your, if I use this module, context, I mean. If I use context, what it'll do is allow you to get the version of your module. That way you can do things like version compares. Hey, if this version is less than or equivalent to this, do this action, otherwise do another action, and you can do those types of version compares inside of there, which is why you get past this module context interface. For this particular exercise, what we want to do is we just want to use the setup, start setup, we're going to use setup, end setup, and then inside of here we're just going to add a column. So that is setup, get connection, add column. Okay. The column is going to be from the store table. The column name is going to be called the country underscore code, and then we're going to have the definition after that. So if I put this, oops, I don't want that. I put this on the next line to make it a little easier to read. I use setup, get table, and it's going to be store. Table aliases have gone away inside of Magento 2, but you still want to use this get table in here because table prefixes are still present. So you want to make sure that you're keeping that information there. Our column name is going to be country code. And then our definition, which is just an array of the appropriate schema information. So inside of here, I've got the type, which is the equivalent of Magento framework DB DDL table. There it is, and that is type text. Okay. Now, if you'll notice, there's also a soft error that's getting thrown that says an unnecessary fully qualified name. What I can do is I can hover over this and hit Alt-Enter, and it'll give me what's called a contextual sensitive menu. And what I can do from there is I can import this class. Importing the class will basically put a use statement up here at the top. So Magento Framework DB DDL table is now there, and then makes your code just a little bit easier to read. So it's very useful. Length, the length, if I can spell it right, length is going to be 2 because our definitions are always going to be too long. We want to make this nullable because we don't want it to interfere with what's already currently there or anything like that. And we also don't want to specify a default for any new stores that were created. Default is null. And I will do a comment that just says this is the country code. Okay. So not too bad. And so that's all we really want to do inside of this upgrade schema. And now this will run every time there's a discrepancy between the version numbers, and it also will run when you first install the system. So this will automatically hit, which is nice. Now, from here what we want to do is we want to now find a way to hook into our system, and we'll do that through the use of a plugin. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to hook into the Magento Framework App Front Controller interface, and we'll do that through the use of the plugin system that Magento provides. So what we'll do inside of here is we'll go to our code, app code, interact 1, and inside of here we will specify a new folder, and it's going to be called front end. Okay, now what the front end is going to do is it's going to specify the scope in which this particular code is going to apply. So if it's di.xml for plugins or for preferences, that'll only apply in the front end scope. And that's new to Magento 2. All right. So inside of here, I'm going to specify an m2 di.xml, which is once again the templating system that we were talking about earlier. And under here, I'm going to do type, name, and it's going to be Magento Framework App Front Controller Interface. Okay. Plugin name GeoIP Redirect, and the type that I want to use, this will be my plugin. So it'll be Interact 1 GeoIP Redirect plugin GeoIP Redirect plugin. Okay, so this basically is just saying, hey, whenever you're using or calling the methods against this particular type, I want you to also consider the code inside of the plugin that I've specified here. And it will use convention in order to determine what methods to call. And you also might be asking, well, wait, this is the front controller interface. Why aren't we doing it against the actual instance that implements this interface? Whenever possible, you want to use the interfaces for your coding to try and create a stable and a consistent and an upgrade, not an upgrade proof, but essentially a more hardened version, more stable version of your module. Because if you're developing against the interfaces don't usually change that much, and that makes it a lot more stable for you to work with. Are there going to be times when you can't always develop it against the interface? Of course, but try to whenever you can and whenever possible. So we're going to create the plugin against this front controller interface. The object manager will take this interface, find the preference for it that was inside of the di.xml, and then from there create the concrete class and then use this plugin against it. Now, so we have all the configuration we need in order to create our plugin file, so let's do that now. If you'll notice inside of this definition that I created, it was under Interact 1 GeoIP Redirect Plugin, GeoIP Redirect Plugin. Class types have been abolished inside of Magento 2, meaning that you're not bound to a particular class type. So whenever you're developing, you don't only have to put it under block or helper or model. You can now put it under whatever makes the most logical sense for your module. So inside of here, I'm going to put it under a plugin directory. And so that way, whenever anybody needs to maintain my module or they need to look up some code inside of my module, they'll know immediately where all my plugin classes belong. I'm going to create a class, and it is going to be called GeoIP Redirect Plugin, which is what the class was that I named inside of that type property inside of the previous one. Now, the plugin classes do not need to extend or implement anything because they use convention in order to determine what classes they need to be hooked into. Okay? So for this particular instance, what we want to do is we want to create a before, okay? Because we have 3 different plugin types that are available in Magento 2. We have before, we have after, and we have around. Before will be called before the method is called, and it allows you to change the arguments that get passed into the method. After will be called after the original method is called, and it allows you to change the return type. And then around allows you to not only do something before and after, but they actually give you an instance of the method as a closure in order for you to call it yourself. So this means that you can not call the method at all, completely change how the method is called, and a lot more refined control. Okay? In our particular instance, what we want to do is we want to do a before. Okay? So we're going to call before dispatch. That's what we want to call. So public function before dispatch. You specify before with the prefix of before, after with after, and around with around. Okay? So like I said, it's convention that allows you to do this. Now this method is going to accept 2 parameters, the original instance as well as the arguments that get passed into it. So the first one is the original instance, and that will be the front controller interface. Front controller interface. Magento Framework App Front Controller Interface. Subject is usually what they call it. And then also the request interface, Magento Framework App Request Interface. And that's going to be the request. Like I said, whenever possible, try to always develop against the interfaces because they remain more stable and they are less likely to change as the module gets updated over time. Okay? And basically what we want to do inside of here is did what we did before, and that was essentially taking the store cookie or the store cookie manager, set the store inside of it, and then be able to load from there. So inside of this, what we'll do is we will get the country code. So country code, and we will develop that here in a second. We will get the store. We need to be able to get the store information. We need to be able to load that store information, and then we need to be able to set the store cookie. Okay? So there's a couple of different things we have to do. We have to get the store. We have to set the store cookie inside of the store cookie manager, and we also have to get the country code. So we're going to kind of work our way through that. So for the store, what we want to do is we want to get an instance of the store model. And how we do that is we do that through what's called dependency injection. Dependency injection basically is an inversion of control that allows an external entity to manage the dependencies of a class versus the class itself. Okay? So we'll use the construct method, and we will pass through every dependency or dependent class that we need for this particular class. We're doing that because the object manager will look at this constructor and automatically pass this stuff for us. So we don't need to manually call it anywhere. We just need to basically ask for it inside of the constructor. And so the object manager will take care of everything else. The object manager will also resolve any preferences. So if I ask for an interface, it'll give me a concrete class, so on and so forth. There is a caveat with this, though. Whenever you have a dependency injection design pattern implemented inside of a platform, you have problems because there are certain classes that rely on external interfaces or dependencies in order to resolve what they do. And what I mean by that is there's going to be times when you're going to essentially have a non-injectable class. And a non-injectable class is basically a class, like I said, that can't do a function on its own. A simple example would be an ORM or a model or something like that that relies on database data to truly do whatever it needs to do. A simple example would be if you want the product model. The product model doesn't really do anything by itself. It needs product data in order to really fulfill its functionality. And so what you do is you can't really inject that because it relies on that external data. However, you can inject other things that help you get that information. And those are called injectable classes. The one that relies on things like data or external factors in order to fulfill its functionality are called non-injectables. The good news is that Magento gives you the ability to create non-injectable classes from an injectable dependency. And one of those instances is called a factory method. And a factory method basically allows you to get that particular instance. And what I need to do for the factory method is I need to get the store factory. And so that would be Magento store model store factory. Store factory. Okay? Now, if you might be coding this and you might find that it's saying, hey, this class doesn't exist. Where's this class? The good news is that if a class doesn't exist and it's one of these classes that will do these functionalities like proxies or interceptors or factories, Magento will auto-generate these. And what I mean by auto-generate is exactly what it sounds like. It'll take, match against a pattern and say, hey, they're trying to accomplish something from trying to call this class. This class may not exist, and so I'm going to create it for them. This reduces the amount of essentially boilerplate code that you would often have to do manually, and Magento 2 will do that for you, which will greatly speed up your development time. So now instead of having to create your own separate store factory and pass through a non-injectable instance, it will just create it for you. So all you do is request it, and Magento will give it to you automatically. So inside of here, once again, I'll do an Alt-Enter, and I'll import the class like we saw earlier. And I'll also do an Alt-Enter to create a contextual sensitive menu over this property that gets passed with a variable that gets assigned to it. And I'll do what's called initialize fields. Initialize fields will basically take that class and automatically set it inside of a private property for me. Reduces the amount of coding that you have to do manually. So inside of here, what I will do is I will do store equals this, store factory, create. And that's all you have to pass, and it will create a non-injectable instance of that store. And then I will do store, load, the country code, and then I will specify that I want to load this by its appropriate country code. That's just an optional second property in which you want to do that. And that was transferred over from Magento 1. Now, should I use a repository for this? Should I use service contracts for this? Should I do all that stuff? And the answer is it varies. So if you're not really changing the functionality of what the repository is doing and you're just fetching that, yes, absolutely use a repository or use a service contract. If it's doing something like this where you want to load it by a separate entity and you can't really use the repository for it, do your best to try and mitigate the amount of implementation details you're working with. Whenever possible, try and use the interfaces. For this particular one, we're going to use the factory because we're going to need to load it by this country code, which is not part of the core. Remember, we made that ourselves in our upgrade schema. The next thing we need is the store cookie manager because that's what got passed inside of that context that we saw previously. So store cookie manager interface. Okay, store cookie manager interface, store cookie manager, and once again I'll initialize this field and so I can set it on property. And then I will say this store cookie manager, set store cookie, and pass through the store. Okay. Now the last thing we need to do is we need to get the country code, and we're going to do that off of our GeoIP location. And so what we need to do is we need to create a model that allows us to do that. So inside of our code, we're going to create a model folder, app code direct one model. And inside of here, we're going to create a class called GeoIP request. GeoIP request. And basically what we want to do inside of here is just call the GeoIP endpoint service and return that appropriate response from it. We want to get our GeoIP, we want to take that and get the information from a third-party service. So inside of our GeoIP request here, we're going to basically say I want to get the country code, get country code, okay? And I want to essentially get that from what's called a GeoIP response. So I'll create a method called function get GeoIP response, okay? And basically, I'm going to get that GeoIP response from its appropriate endpoint. And I want to make sure that I'm not loading things too many times, so I'll put that into what's called a response property. So, I'm in the wrong spot. Okay, here we go. Private response. Okay, get GeoIP response, and basically I'm going to say if I do not currently have a response on this, I want to set the response. This response equals, I need to basically get the response, okay? And I will do that from a method that I'll call this get response, okay? Now I haven't created that method yet, I'm about to right now. And then from there, I will return this response. Let's create that public function get response. It can also be private if you, depending on what you're doing. Actually, I think I will make that private. Make that a private response because I'm doing the low-level functionality at that point. What I'll use is I'll just use the Zen Frameworks curl, or actually it's Magento Frameworks curl class that allows me to use curl to request an endpoint. Okay. So in order to get that, I will create a dependency injection, public function construct, and inside of here I will do the Magento framework. It is HTTP client curl. And actually what I do want is I want the curl factory, because once again curl doesn't do anything on its own. It actually has to get an external source to fulfill its functionality. So I'm going to do curl factory here. Okay, so it's curl factory. Oops, I don't want that. I will import this class, import class so it's easier to read. I will initialize this field, and inside of here I'll do client equals this curl factory create. Okay. Now I can also do a contextual sensitive menu that allows me to tell my IDE what exactly it is I'm getting. And let's see if I can do this instead. Magento framework HTTP client curl. I'll import that to make it easier to read as well. And now whenever I'm using client and working with client, it will auto-complete it according to curl. I'm going to set the timeout because I don't want this to hang for the default value, which could be up to 30 seconds. I just want to set it according to just a very basic, maybe 2 seconds or something like that. And I can put that inside of a constant, and I'll do that. So it'll be, I'll go up here, I'll create a constant, and I might as well create the other constants as well. So this will be request timeout, and that's in milliseconds. I'll also do a constant, the endpoint URL, which is, we're going to use freegeoip.net because that uses the MaxMind database and it gives us an endpoint already. And constant, constant request type, because you can actually request this by a freegeoip.net in multiple ways. So I'm going to use JSON for this particular format. Set timeout, self request timeout, and then client, I do believe it is get, that's right. So get, and basically it'll be self endpoint URL, and then that is self request type, request type, which is JSON, and then the final part, which is it needs to be our client IP. So where are we going to get that? We're going to get that from the HTTP request that we need to call or request inside of our constructor. HTTP will have the client available to us. All right, so this will be Magento framework. Oops. I'll do that again. Magento framework app request HTTP, and HTTP, once again, import an initialize field, import class, initialize field, HTTP, and then down here it will be this HTTP get client IP. Okay. Call the get client, the client get method that will call, and then we will return the body response from that. Return client get body. So that will get the response for us. Okay. And this response right here, the GeoIP response, right here, get the country code. Now this comes through as JSON string, so we need to be able to turn that into an appropriate object, or we need to JSON encode it essentially. So what we can do for this is we can create another method, private function get response from endpoint, and that can return via a JSON helper or just a basic JSON to code if you want. We don't have to get too fancy here, but the JSON helper is Magento framework JSON helper data, and that's JSON helper. That's what I want to call it. Import and initialize, and then I will return this JSON helper, JSON to code, this get response, and up here what I'll do is I'll say get response from endpoint. Okay. So get response gets our client body. This will do the JSON decoding. This will do the get GeoIP response. And what we need to do is this needs to be considered as an object. And then what I'll do from here is I'll do this get GeoIP response country code. So now I can get the country code. So now we have basically all the functionality necessary. I will copy this reference. That copies the full namespace as well as the class name. And I will inject this into my plugin. App code, interact 1, plugin, GeoIP redirect plugin. Go up to our construct, paste this code, GeoIP request, import, class, initialize field, and from here, here's our country code, this GeoIP request, get country code. Now it gets passed into the store model, and we load it, and then we set the store cookie. Final thing we want to do is we want to return null. If you return null in a before plugin, it will not change the properties. If you return it as an array with the different properties that you change, it will change those arguments that you get passed into the original method. This allows you to manipulate what gets passed in. It's very useful. But we're not doing that. We're just setting it because we want this to hook early inside of the plugin, and we don't want to actually change anything else inside of it. Okay? Now, the final things that we would essentially do is we just do some command line options, and it's nothing too fancy. Basically what we would do is we would do a bin Magento module enable and then a bin Magento setup upgrade. Okay? When we do those, basically it will enable the module and then it will also install the module through the install and upgrade schema and set the current version number inside of our setup module table inside of our database. So with that, we are just about out of time. And so this is the basics of our modules. We have pretty much a complete module here, and now it will be able to set the store based upon the GeoIP that we have inside of there. Okay? Are there extra things we could do here? Of course. We could do a certain number of refactoring. We can also nest this in some appropriate try-catches. We could also look for a couple more interfaces to be able to develop against to make sure that all the things are there. We can do some more error checking and fact checking to make sure the stability of the code is there as well, but we get the basic idea of how this Magento 2 module is assembled. And basically, essentially in about 30-40 minutes, we created an entire working module with complete code, namespaces, all of that is there and ready to go. Okay? Now, with that, let's go ahead and return back here. And yeah, we're basically we built that, and so with that we're pretty much done developing this module, and now I will turn it back over to Amanda.
All right, great, thanks Ryan. That was a lot of information, so if you guys have questions, go ahead and submit them now, and we'll go ahead and get started on what we have. Our first question, can you use a separate IDE for into development?
Yes, you absolutely can. I use PHP Storm because it's basically focused more on PHP development, which the Magento 2 platform is built off of, but there is nothing that absolutely requires you to use that. If you use NetBeans or something like that, there might be certain features that may or may not be there, but you absolutely can. Yes, you can even just use basic text editors if you want to. There's nothing that forces a certain IDE to be used.
Our next one says, I get errors whenever I run setup upgrade. What's the reason?
Usually whenever you get errors inside of the setup upgrade, it's something, maybe a very generic one or maybe a very misleading one, like something like Composer JSON missing or something to that effect. Usually what that is that's often a error in the code of one of 3 files that you need to look at. Now this could be something as small as a casing error or a nesting error, but you want to look inside of your module XML, you want to look inside of your registration PHP, and you also want to look inside of your composer.json file. That's why it can be kind of misleading, because I think it will just say composer JSON is missing or can't read from composer JSON. So it will actually be one of those 3 files that will cause that error.
Our third question is a composer JSON required for a module?
Technically speaking, no. However, if you are going to submit to the marketplace or you're going to manage your modules for your Magento instance inside of Composer, you do want to use a Composer JSON. So the beginning part of it is absolutely, you know, if, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. If you are not submitting to the marketplace and it's internal only, you don't have to have a Composer JSON. You do have to have it if you're submitting to the marketplace or you're managing your dependencies through Composer.
The next one is, how are the factories generated?
Factories are generated through the object manager, through code completion. Inside, if I can pull it up here really quickly, inside of the lib internal Magento framework, under the object manager, which is down here, there is an area called code, and then there's generators. And basically what it'll do is it'll look for names or patterns. So how I put store and put factory at the end of it will automatically say, oh, that class doesn't exist. But before I throw a fatal error, let me see if there's any code generators available. And sure enough, one of them is factory, and that's how it does it. Basically, the entry point and the main thing that does this is the object manager.
Should I run compilations after setup upgrade?
If you're in active development mode, which is your, if you're actively developing Magento 2, the short answer is no. because you can set developer mode inside of Magento, which will allow your code to be auto-generated on the fly. So every time you run setup upgrade, you do not need to run your compilations. However, in production mode, that answer is a definitive yes, because you want to make sure all that code is there and available for production mode. Production mode does not generate classes on the fly. It assumes they're already there. So yes, you need to run it in production mode. So whenever you deploy to production, you will run that and you'll make sure those compilations are there. In developer mode, no, it'll generate them for you.
How do I install an Into extension from the marketplace?
There's a couple ways to do that. Mostly the way that I do it is after you've purchased it or after you've essentially said that you wanted it, you'll use Composer to get that from repo.magento.com. There is also a way to do it inside of the admin panel. I do believe it is store management, or I'm not exactly sure the exact menu, but you can also do it from the admin panel inside of Magento too. So you can do it whichever way you're most comfortable with.
What about unit testing?
So unit testing we didn't cover here because that would have easily made this session twice as long. Some of the questions that I will get when it comes to unit testing is unit testing required for your module to be accepted in the marketplace? According to the latest information I have read, that answer is no. However, all of the unit tests that come with the core of Magento still need to pass, meaning that if you altered functionality that now makes the unit tests that are inside of the core Magento fail, your module will not be accepted. You do not need to write unit tests yourself in order for your module to pass, according at least to the latest information I've read, but I highly recommend that you do. It just makes for a more stable environment, makes for a more stable module. You can tell early on if something has broken or changed without having to do a severe backtrace or rework a lot of your code. So it's very useful to have it. So.
Our next one is, do you use Vagrant Box with your Magento? If so, did you hook your PHP Storm IDE with Vagrant?
Yes, I do use Vagrant with Magento 2. I do a couple of things a little bit differently according to how Vagrant works. Because I'm just using the standard VirtualBox setup with it, VirtualBox's mounting and the file I/O is just terrible performance-wise. So what I do is I do a PHP Storm auto deployment. So whenever there's a code change, I will do an auto deployment, and I will do a sync against the var generation folder. So essentially what I've got is I've got a sync that will happen from the app code, my vendor namespace directory, and also from var generation. And I won't mount anything else. Otherwise the performance will be basically, it'll just completely degrade in performance to where it takes forever just for a single page to load. The short answer is yes, I do hook them up together, and I do use Vagrant, yeah.
Our last one here, could you repeat, why did your before method return null?
The before method returns null because if you return null, basically you are telling the interceptor, or basically the code that manages plugin functionality for Magento 2, that I was doing something, but I don't want to change any of the arguments that get passed into the original method. So the original method is a dispatch method, and it gets passed an instance of this request here. If I return null, this request does not change. However, if I return request here, it will actually change what argument gets passed into the original method. So if I wanted to set a completely different value in here, because it's not just objects that get passed, maybe a value is passed like a string or an int or something like that. If I want to change what that is, that's what I need to return instead as an array. All right.
Okay, our last one here, a real quick one. What is Ryan's level of coolness?
It is an extreme level of coolness, if I do say so myself, but that is, of course, a subjective answer.
Yeah, it's pretty chilly in here. Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
I think that's it.
Okay.
All right, so don't miss the rest of our series. There's one part left, how to submit the module into the marketplace, or how to submit into the marketplace. On July 13th at 2 p.m., you can register at interact1/webinars. And thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate Ryan coming in. It's super awesome he gets to do this. You can ask us any more questions at support@nrf1 or visit us at our website or send us a message on Twitter. And that's it. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.